My name is Evgeny Dingup. I'm the director of the Center for Languages and Cultures at the University of Southern California. I also work here as a professor of Russian. And it's my great privilege and honor to welcome all of you. We have 440 registrants for this conference from 40 countries, which is amazing. And we're so proud that so many people register for this conference and are interested in this topic. So today we're going to have the whole day of panels, presentations. This event will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel later. Hopefully next week we will make it available to everyone. So please share with people who couldn't come, people who you know are interested in this topic. We'll also send you a survey asking you about your feedback, asking you for your feedback, and also maybe ideas for future events. We would like to keep this conversation going and engage with you later on this or many other topics related to language pedagogy. I will also be happy to send a certificate of attendance for those who attended this conference live. So there will be an option to choose or to request the certificate in that survey form. So look out for that form. All right, so now I'm going to introduce to you Liana Stepanyan, my co-host, actually the person who is, without whom that conference wouldn't be possible. So Liana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. We are very excited to host you all today. Thank you all for joining today for this Conference on Gender Inclusive Language Instruction. My name is Liana Stepanyan, and I'm Associate Professor of Teaching of Spanish at USC, and it is my pleasure to co-host with Evgeny today's conference. And I would like to thank the sponsors of this conference also, without whom this would have not been possible. It's the USC Center for Languages and Cultures that Evgeny Dingup directs, also USC's Department of French and Italian, USC's German Studies program, USC's Department of Eastern Asian Languages and Cultures. And I would also thank all of you today's speakers and attendees for joining us today. This was probably the easiest conference to put together because there was so much enthusiasm and interest in it. The conference program, I will just drop in the chat right now. It's posted online, but here's what is going to happen today. And while you take a few minutes to adjust your settings, we will wait for people to join, and we're starting shortly. A few reminders, all of our attendees are in listen mode. You can hear and see us. You can post comments and share resources in the chat. We'll be happy to share them with all of you at the end of this or rather after the conference. And we are, as Evgeny mentioned, recording the sessions, and we'll be sharing both the videos and the resources that the presenters and the attendees share with us. And if you have questions for the speakers, please submit them in the Q&A section, and the moderator of each session will select a few questions for the speakers to address after the presentations. So we're doing the questions after each presentation. And it's 9:05. For the sake of time, we are going to start, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Kris Knisely. I'm going to share my screen. Here it is. So Dr. Kris Knisely is an assistant professor of French and intercultural competence, as well as affiliated faculty with both SLAT and TSRC at the University of Arizona. Dr. Knisely's research in its broader terms considers gender and sexuality in linguistic, sociocultural, and instructional dimensions of language learning. This entails asking how the linguistically and culturally situated ways that we perceive and embody gender enter into language education, what normativities manifest there, and how those normativities can be laid bare, upended, and unscripted by language teachers and learners. Within this general frame, Dr. Knisely focuses on the culturally situated linguistic practices of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people who language in French, particularly as they can inform the development and articulation of trans-affirming language curricula, materials, research, training, and pedagogies. Dr. Knisely's work has appeared in various edited volumes in journals such as Contemporary French Civilizations, CFC Intersections, Critical Multilingualism Studies, Foreign Language Annals, and so on. Dr. Knisely is also the co-editor with Eric Russell, UC Davis, of Redoing Linguistic Worlds, Unmaking Gender Binaries, Remaking Gender Pluralities, to be published by Multilingual Matters in 2023. Dr. Knisely has already shared some resources with us. I will drop this in a second in the chat. Thank you very much for this, Dr. Knisely. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Dr. Knisely today in our webinar. A virtual round of applause.
Thank you, Liana. Thank you, Evgeny. And thank you to everyone who helped make this conference happen. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you so that you will see this presentation that I've got going. The link to the resources are in the chat. And without further ado, let me dive right in. It's my honor and my pleasure to be here with you today, to spend a moment being a part of your beginning or your continuing a journey towards increasingly gender-just language and gender-just language pedagogies. In the spirit of a dialogic, responsive, reflexive, and continuously evolving pedagogy, and in the constraints of having about 30 minutes to take you on a whirlwind tour of theoretical framing and practical applications, I've put together that webpage of resources that Liana mentioned. The idea of this is that it's something that you can return to as needed. And this way, you can also sit back and digest and really be here, knowing that you don't necessarily have to take any notes because all of my slide text and all of my main points are already prepared for you in that document. So I want you all to sort of be able to be in the moment and not have to worry about getting it down to be able to come back to later. And my talk today is really going to be about translogics or epistemologies and how that helps us approach thinking about language education from new vantage points. I'll get into some of these concrete examples as a part of talking through what this means, but I'm going to prioritize presenting this framing or scaffolding for our thinking because I contend that shifting the ways that we think about what language is and what we do as language educators in conversation with trans cultures of language, of being, and of knowing is really how we start to unlock the kinds of thought processes that will generate more ideas about praxis than I could ever cover today. Now, that said, I want to encourage you to ask whatever very concrete and applied questions you might have during Q&A so that we can all think together about those practical paths forward as much as any other kinds of questions that you might have as a part of our conversation. One more critical note before I really dive in. I want to make clear that when I use the word trans today, I'm using it in its absolute broadest possible sense in order to denote people who flout cisnormative ways of thinking and of being. This includes people who do use trans or culturally specific terms like two-spirit, but this also includes non-binary people who may or may not self-situate as trans. And this also includes anyone who refuses to participate in gender modality as a trans-cis dichotomy. I want us to understand trans today in the context of it being one of many words that are always incomplete in their description of human embodiment and ways of being. So in order to start with this theoretical scaffolding, I want to introduce trans-affirming queer inquiry-based pedagogies, TAQIBPs. TAQIBPs give us a really good start at making explicit the hidden curriculum, power structures, and personally held biases, and they can be useful in searching for gender liberation within and alongside anti-racist and decolonial pedagogical strategies, because all of these forms of oppression are inextricably linked with one another. And Everything we know in queer applied linguistics tells us that we as language educators need this frame because we're compensating for existing gaps in our training, in our materials, and frankly, in our broader field. We already know that queer and trans topics make up a non-trivial part of our students' lives. And yet instructors, by and large, tend to feel fairly underprepared to handle conversations that really meaningfully engage with queer and trans people and queer and trans lingua cultures. Teacher education programs contribute to this situation in that they largely ignore queer and trans considerations, and mainstream language teaching materials are predominantly cis heteronormative. So in short, we're swimming upstream through a lot of different avenues, and TAQIBPs come in important ways because they help us think about inclusion, sure, but more so they help us understand that this is about so much more than inclusion alone. This is about developing a contemporary literacy that involves thinking with trans knowledges and through trans epistemologies. As I fly through an introduction to TAQIBPs, I want to remind you that everything is in that handout and written out in long form as well in my open access article with Josh Piaz in Critical Multilingualism Studies. So broadly speaking, queer inquiry-based pedagogies entail questioning norms and showing how problematic identity categories are. Here, we want to show students that norms are something we create and collectively negotiate as culturally situated languaging communities, and that all classification systems are gross oversimplifications of our complex realities. We're teaching our students how to engage in restive problematizing and how to expose and interrogate normativity. That means that we're teaching them how to always be asking why the world is the way that it is, who benefits from that status quo, how language and culture are involved in the creation and maintenance of those normativities, and how we might imagine alternatives. All of this, not just when it comes to gender and sexuality. So what does this look like in real time for our pedagogical goals to be to make students aware of queer and trans people, queer and trans lives, and the concerns that inflect them? To make students aware of how language and identity are intertwined in really complex and messy ways. To help them think critically about this, and to help them equip them with the linguistic and rhetorical skills that they need to advocate for themselves and others. All of this in and through our efforts to make our classrooms more inclusive of students of all genders and sexualities. Perhaps most importantly, we have to explore with and alongside our students, which means we have to release any sort of urge that we have to perform the role of LGBTQ expert in favor of focusing on a deep, critical, and sustained engagement with queer and trans people and the concerns that inflect their lives. This allows us to decenter power in the classroom to the extent that that's ever possible. And in this way, it's an iterative and self-reflective, a co-constructed pedagogy, not any sort of exhaustive knowledge that's needed for us to create conditions for meaningful inclusion and representation. This allows us to move forward with bringing queer and trans knowledges into our pedagogical practice, even when we don't feel adequately trained or adequately supported by our materials, by our departments, our institutions, and sometimes even by our legislatures. This whole process is something that will always be ongoing. But that's not a bad thing because it brings students into the realizing of that ongoing collaborative practice of constantly learning together. And this focus on critical, self-reflective practice for everyone further makes clear that bringing queer and trans knowledges to bear in language classrooms is a continuous and collective responsibility that can't be left to community insiders alone. In this process, we have to avoid a festivals and foods type of multiculturalism. We're looking at valuing, normalizing, and really drawing on trans people's knowledges so that it's an inclusion in our everyday curriculum, but also so that we're rethinking what we do as languagers and as language educators with trans epistemologies in mind. This entails developing critical analytical lenses with our students, where we pick apart and draw attention to how normative discourses obfuscate certain lives or even attempt to render them ineffable, attempt to render them unlanguageable. Our avoiding of this sort of trans day and tokenization is something that has to be carried through into our objectives and into our assessments, because what we assess, whether we like it or not, is what ends up being valued. Expressly weaving translingual cultures into our goals and objectives desensationalizes gender-just content, and it demonstrates that queerness and transness and identity more broadly are valued parts of languaging and language learning. If we have students using these ways of thinking, knowing, and languaging, being assessed on them, and being thoughtful about why they matter to each of us and to all of us, it helps them really think about this not as some sort of fashion topic or some quick changing linguistic phenomenon that will come and go, but as something that opens up really what we're doing in language altogether. And our articulation of this value and what this can do for students in our language learning goals is something that can be buttressed by research into gender-just language pedagogies. To briefly summarize, recent research has demonstrated that including trans knowledges and linguistic practices via gender-just pedagogies responds to the ethical imperatives to include learners and educators of all genders, to provide a foundation for contemporary literacy, which entails an ability to critically, fluidly, flexibly, and intersectionally discuss gender and all other aspects of being and belonging. They can also help us foster a more accurate and robust understanding of language as a complex adaptive system, and contend with the ways that this inherent variation and change produce rich and complex relations among various linguistic co-cultures. It can help us understand language and gender not as things that are, but as concomitantly social and relational acts that we do and do together. Research has also demonstrated that students who learn about trans knowledges and linguistic practices make significantly fewer grammatical and lexical errors than students who don't, without any difference in the complexity of the language they produce. And gender-just pedagogies can even positively contribute to student success with notoriously challenging forms and structures, as my 2022 foreign language annals piece has shown. We're talking about things like noun class, but also verb mood, right? Things that you might not necessarily expect to come out of teaching about translanguaging. Research has equally shown us that these pedagogies can help foster an ability and desire to communicate effectively, appropriately, and ethically with people whose cultures are other than one's own, and that these pedagogies can help develop or help prepare students to position themselves as multilingual subjects, to advocate for themselves and others, and to otherwise understand, reframe, and manipulate relations of power. Recent research has also demonstrated that gender-just pedagogies are a viable tool for increasing students' exposure to, awareness of, and ability to engage in intersectional thinking. In my study, students who learned about gender justice were more than 17 times more likely to demonstrate intersectional awareness than those who didn't. And so all of this comes together as I don't want to say patchwork, but as a collection of evidence that when we allow for complexity in how gender is taken up in and through language, we're not placing ethics in competition with student outcomes, but are rather placing ethics in service of them. Our goal here is not to have some sort of evangelizing mission of changing hearts and minds, as Joshua Paez has noted many times, but it's rather about cultivating a learning community where all students are met with respect, and importantly, where we're working together to dismantle marginalization, violence, and oppression without reifying discourses that limit understandings of trans people to these domains. In the words of Z. Nicolazzo, we may be from oppression, but are not solely constituted of oppression. At its most basic level, this implies resisting cisnormativity and assuming that trans people are present, whether we're aware of it or not. Just as visibility alone isn't liberatory, we cannot know. And we don't need to know someone's existence as trans in order to unscript gender in our pedagogies and our curricula. Any trans-affirming pedagogy must always be trans-affirming. You'll forgive me, I'm joining you from the desert, so a little bit of liquid is necessary. You might have noticed the ways that gender-just pedagogies are relational pedagogies of care. This is intentional because, as I discuss in Redoing Linguistic Worlds, language and gender are social, relational, embodied acts, not things. And this is something that's really critical to trans epistemologies, to trans ways of knowing and being. When we let go of the expectation that most everyone is or should be cisgender, meaning cisnormativity, and the prejudices and discrimination that this often entails, cissexism and transphobia, we're opening ourselves up to an infinite galaxy of possibilities for doing gender beyond what the cisnormative imagination can contain. In so doing, we underscore gender as something that's fundamentally social and relational, as something that is interactionally and collaboratively realized in myriad ways across time and linguocultural contexts. These infinite possibilities for gender exist in the ways that we group and continuously regroup commonalities in roles, practices, and identities, in the ongoing renegotiation of the legible categories into which we filter those groupings, and in the ways that people actively position themselves within or against the social groupings of which they're aware. This infiniteness also involves the concept of gender modality, that is, ways of being one's gender, such as trans, cis, or various novi modalities that don't fit a trans-cis dichotomy. This understanding of gender, not as a thing that exists a priori, but as something that is done collaboratively, as something that is continuously made and remade in interaction, resonates in important ways with why I use terms like languaging and languagers. Language is not most centrally a thing capable of possessing particular forms or qualities, or capable of doing or not doing a particular function. It's rather an ongoing relational process dependent upon and emerging within interaction between humans. It's a multimodal, whole-bodied action in and through which our very worlds are continuously created and recreated. Language is a verb, engaged in by languagers, unrestricted by the oral modality of speakers or the stakeless passivity of users. Languaging is a purposeful, equitative act, and in languaging, the patterned outcome of such communicative processes, the rendering real through rendering linguistic. These understandings of language and gender as concomitantly embodied social and relational acts form a critical foundation for working with trans knowledges as they relate to how we do language and gender and how we do them together. We language because we are a part of social languaging collectives through which we learned and continuously relearn to do language. All surface residue, ranging from words to utterances, lexicons to grammars, speech acts to semiotic performances, are the outward manifestation of inherited patterns of use of this instrumentalized tool, ones that each new participant in a linguocultural community reinvents, even as they reiterate them ad infinitum. While it may seem a very banal statement to make, it's a critical assertion. Very frequently, and most often reflexively and not reflectively, we state that one or another language has some form or quality, does or does not do some function, and is or is not in taxonomic relation to others according to one or more forms, qualities, or functions. But this is a perversion of the humanistic nature of language, one that might work really well as shorthand. I do it too, but it's one that renders opaque what's really happening in linguistic life. Languagers are not simply passive users of the pre-established inherited systems that have been foisted upon them, but agentive participants in the continuous recreation of in-languaged reality. By challenging antecedent enlanguagements, by transgressing so-called rules of languaging, and by languaging new ideas and realities, they're opening up space for new ideational worlds. This is at the core of translinguocultural life, the linguocultural lives that we're working to bring into teaching and learning. Languagers proposing innovative forms, deploying novel structures, and challenging antecedent prescriptions and patterns aren't merely challenging prior enlanguagements or adding to the systems they've inherited, but are redoing linguistic worlds, their own, of course, but also those of their fellow languagers. And as we guide the languaging collectives through which our students learn and continuously relearn to do language, we have to bring this intentional resistance to cislingual prescriptivism and engage with the remaking of the linguistic world that end up allowing for fuller expression and enlanguagement for all of us. What's at stake here is not simply the relabeling of type A and type B as something other than masculine or feminine for languages where binary structures abound, although this can also have its pedagogical and epistemological benefits. Rather, what's most important is the expansion of possible categories beyond two types, and their decoupling from reductive assumptions about physical embodiments and specific gender identities. There's no deep concern that la table, the table, is subsumed in a particular noun class in French, for example, whether this be called grammatically feminine, type A, une class, or something else. Of far, far greater and more immediate importance is the fact that people who are neither exclusively women nor men have been and still are faced with the symbolic violence of having to conform to the morphological il, that is, to the un class, which traditionally gestures towards masculinity, or elle, that is, to the une class, which traditionally gestures towards femininity. Of importance is recognizing what languagers are doing in translingual cultures, francophone translingual cultures in the case of this example, and learning to peripherally participate in those lingual cultures with and alongside our students. I've included here on the slide for you some of the most common ways that people are enlanguaging non-binarity in French, because some of you may be teaching French, but also because I'm guessing Ben Papadopoulos will mention later in the initiative panel and as I've argued as well in my Modern Language Journal piece that's forthcoming in the next couple of months here, there are lots of commonalities in the ways that people are figuring their way through language, especially when we're talking about structural commonalities, although not only. We can talk more about this translanguaging in the Q&A if you'd like, but let me walk through a couple of language examples here just to sort of show you what's going on in French. So if we look at the top left here first, we have the sort of pronouns that tend to show up most often in French, although there are some 56 that I've encountered so far, if I'm not mistaken on my number. One of the common ways, and one that has received much media attention, is this merging and rehybridization of the traditional il and elle into yel, spelled any number of ways. But we also have people using the empty set symbol, ol, and oftentimes this is being used by agender people who are saying, no gender for me, please, but not only. We also have ul and al that show up. The traditional salut and said get remixed into salui, and in the plural salut. Elle and lui get remixed into elle lui, and in the plural elle. Something that shows up across a great number of languages is mix as an honorific. We also have man, tan, san, le, or le, a. And this is also something common in translingual cultures, is multiple possible pronunciations, in part because a lot of these are novel forms, and also because of the role of written online communities for trans people. What may be even more applicable across a number of languages are these strategies that exist not just for direct non-binary languaging, but also for indirect non-binary languaging. That is, the ways that we circumlocute or recast without necessarily specifically pointing towards trans people. We have things like inclusive punctuated suffixation. In German, we also see things like the gender gap, the little line underneath, whose name escapes me in English. We also see the gender star. So we see lots of different ways of using punctuation in written contexts to gesture towards non-binarity specifically. In a more indirect way, we often encounter nouns and adjectives that are neutral in their pronunciation, that is, that are phonetically equivalent or invariable in their various forms. We also run into quite a bit of paraphrasing. So how do we get the same information across through different structural means? And we have in many languages the possibility to set up the subject of a sentence using an invariable form like quelqu'un, which is someone, and always follows the en classe markers regardless of who we're referencing with quelqu'un, and une personne, a person, that is conversely always une classe, no matter the person's gender to whom it refers. So I'll be happy to discuss these forms, structures, and their pedagogical applications further during Q&A, or to point you to the many resources that do. But I want to use the minute or two that I have left here to note that we can begin by presenting forms that have been empirically among the most frequently used, right alongside their more canonical counterparts, from the first day of the very first class forward, carefully framing the introduction of these forms with explicit discussion of normativity in language, linguistic autonomy, and the right to self-definition, helping students understand that these ways of languaging are used in some vibrant linguistic co-cultures and are not always present in more cisnormative mainstream lingua cultures. This information is a part of equipping them, both with the language and with the symbolic competence that they need in order to be able to advocate for themselves and others across the many lingua cultures they'll participate in. It's a part of equipping them to live this linguistic change in progress with and alongside of us. These forms can systematically show up in verb charts and vocabulary lists wherever they are or can be made relevant. And they should show up in direct connection with and as a part of engagement with the people and communities who use, who language in these ways. See, I almost said use, catching myself on the reflexive and not reflective bit. But why do they need to show up with trans people? Because this is how we move quickly beyond allegories and symbols of gender non-normativity and instead treat gender as the structural, social, and political issue that it is. Engaging with trans people drives a more robust understanding of what it means to do language in trans ways. And as students grow in the complexity of the languaging that they can do, and we move towards increasingly advanced levels, there are limitless possibilities for including trans people, trans narratives, and translingual cultures, which we can also talk about more during Q&A if you want. But to force myself to come to a quick close and summarize the big ideas, which you can also find in the starting ideas for applying TAQIBP's infographic that's in your handout. Linguistic inclusion has to be about more than inclusion alone. It has to be about a broader engagement with translingual cultures and an ongoing ethical relationality with trans people. As such, moving towards gender justice in language education requires a broader ethos regarding gender in the classroom. What I mean by this is, are we using stereotypes of colors in ways that conflate grammatical and social gender, ways that reinforce binarity through pinks and blues or what have you? And then could we choose alternatives from memory aids that don't risk reifying normative conceptions of social gender? Broadly, are we avoiding normativities as much as we can? And then do we critique those normativities with our students when they do appear? Asking, what is the status quo? Why is it this way? Who benefits? Who's disadvantaged? And what maintains it? Do we invite sharing pronouns and agreements via private and voluntary first day surveys or other private and voluntary means, rather than making public demands or making public invitations that could be misread as a demand because of the power structures that we're involved in our position as educators in a classroom setting? And is this ethos then reflected in the entire course experience for our students? For example, does this systematically carry into assessment practices? As one illustration, do we invite including names, pronouns, and agreements on assignments so that we can provide relevant linguistic feedback and mitigate assumptions? Do we not shy away from assessing students' learning of these ways of languaging where it's fitting, even if we start by focusing on assessing for recognition or on the processes that translinguistic practices teach, like circumlocution? Gender just pedagogy is about seeking out, laying bare, and upending all forms of normativity. It is a critical, relational, and collaborative pedagogy of care that honors and revels in the knowledges and lingual cultures of trans people. And with that, I thank you all again for joining, and I look forward to what will surely be a dynamic Q&A as well as a thoughtful rest of today's conference with all of the presentations that are lined up today to keep conversations going. And not just today, but for the rest of our language lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Knisely. This was a very extremely powerful and stimulating presentation. And thank you for sharing with us your expertise and this very thorough resource package. We've received already lots of positive comments. And one of the things that I would like to echo is, I don't have any questions. This was very thorough. However, there indeed are questions. So I'm going to read a few of them. Some of them are not strictly linguistic, but I'm going to read them anyway. So
Absolutely.
The first question that I'm going to read is this. I'm going to synthesize. Sorry, some of them are pretty long. So this one says, my department doesn't support me in my use of gender inclusive language in the classroom. Are there any specific steps that you recommend that I can take to help change this?
Yes. So the first thing that I'd suggest is think about coalition building. Think about, even if your department doesn't support you, is there another language department where colleagues in another language might be able to join together with you and sort of create momentum across languages? I also think that there's great power in collaborating with students. A lot of times faculty are convinced that this is going to be a problem when students are by and large on board. I'm working on an article right now, and it'll come out soon, where even the students who show sort of, I don't really care about any of this, consistently say that they think it makes them better at doing language to know these things. And so I think that there's some negotiation to be had between coalition building and then using the resources that are out there, using the research that is out there to sort of slowly but surely push things forward. And then I also think that there's always a bit of you do you behind closed doors that has to happen too. And so I think that you can navigate that with those things together. The other thing that I will recommend is Joshua Payaz and I, in our 2021 article, if you go all the way to the end of it, there is a section on developing and building out these sorts of coalitions, and there's some sort of guiding questions to help you think about it. So with my ramble today, I'll offer you that as a concrete resource to sort of work with as well.
Thank you very much. The next question is from K-12 educators. So this one says, I teach K-12, and when is appropriate to start these conversations with my students?
Now, yesterday. That's my perhaps a bit flippant answer, but I think there's a lot of fear that this is inappropriate. And we see that with queer topics, we see that with trans topics. But I think you have to remember that children tend to articulate their gender by about 3 to 5 years old. So by the time they're in school with anyone, they're already deeply aware of gender, and they're having fun with it until they understand that coloring outside the lines, if you'll allow me the analogy, has consequences. So in that way, it's a topic that they're ready for. And I also think we have to think about what it says about queer and trans people if we treat this as something inappropriate for children when it's not. These are language forms that exist, that they may encounter in the world, that they may need for themselves, that they'll almost definitely need for a friend. And we sort of fuel this stigmatization and this fear-mongering around queer and trans people if we don't recognize that there's nothing inappropriate about any of this for small children, right? We're talking about language play and self-expression, and those are things that children are hilariously good at. So as a former kindergarten teacher, so from one teacher who gets these feelings and the worry about what you'll have to say to parents to another, now is the time. And I'll say I have a forthcoming chapter in Honing Our Craft that gets at, what do I do if I'm teaching in an environment where, especially in K-12, like I'm not allowed or I fear a lot of backlash? And if you don't have access to that, I will invite you to contact me directly, and we'll make sure that we find a way to get you access to that. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. The next question is about Spanish, but it applies to other languages as well. It says, I feel very strongly about using gender inclusive language in my Spanish classroom, and while teaching gender inclusive language in the classroom may not present any pedagogic difficulties, using gender inclusive structures and elements like the X can be very difficult to implement in online courses and programs. How do we more readily introduce gender inclusive languages and structures in online courses?
I appreciate that question. And I'm also someone who teaches online. I think this is part of the de-dramatization of it as well, in that you're teaching your students other forms online, and I recognize that there's part of this that doesn't exactly ring true, but I'm very much of the opinion that these are forms and structures like many others. If I'm teaching my students youth language from a particular context, that's also something novel that I have to work in. If I'm teaching anything outside of the standard ideology of whatever language variety I'm supposed to be teaching, in my case, something that approximates highly educated white Parisian French, that's also departing. And so I think thinking about these forms and structures as another linguistic co-culture can help us sort of get out of the, well, wait, this is a special thing that takes special energy. And in some ways it does, but in most ways, I would argue that it doesn't. And so I have that to say. And then I also think that teaching online actually offers us some pretty awesome opportunities to think about this, in that our students are already engaging with us on the internet, and we can give them web quests or internet tasks to go out and observe this language being in use online. I keep dropping references, and for that I apologize. But I am currently working, Julieta Fernandez and Chantel Warner are editing a open access textbook for applied linguistics. And my chapter in there walks through how to work with students with data from trans and non-binary language and communities. And so I would also be happy to get you that full reference and make sure you have that, and would suggest that some of this very controlled data analysis with students might be a really great way to do it, especially online, especially where you can tell them, okay, observe this, and then go out to Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, whatever they're using, depending on the age you're teaching, and keep going from there. So those are my initial thoughts, and I hope there's something in there that speaks back to what was behind your question.
Yeah, we're getting all sorts of wonderful comments here. We're very grateful for today's conversation. It was thought-provoking and inspiring and emotional and exciting. So please join me in giving a very warm virtual round of applause to Dr. Kris Knisely. And we will be sharing the resources. We apologize, there is no time to ask all of the questions, but we will be sharing the resources that Dr. Knisely mentioned. We will be sharing the video recordings and all the information that the attendees share in the chat as well. Thank you all for your interesting and very meaningful questions. And I think we all learned a lot today. This was very encouraging. And the word that I saw the most in the chat today was affirming. Thank you for this very interesting conversation, Dr. Knisely.